Story 1. You get the general rated version of many wars and major events throughout the 1800s in elementary and middle school. It is usually not until later in high school or college that you learn more about what actually happened. Story 2. Apparently, the native peoples were not as big a fan of the European settlers as I was led to believe, and Ho Chi Minh really wanted to be a United States ally after World War II. Story 3. I went to school in Alabama in the 1990s. Most of the United States history from slavery through Jim Crow was heavily skewed to fit a bias promoted by the Daughters of the Confederacy. They even had a program every year where the women would come and talk to us about the South and our history. This was rural Alabama. I had friends from Birmingham and Montgomery who were surprised when I mentioned it once. Story 4. Teachers used to say that you cannot always take a computer or calculator with you. They were quite wrong. Story 5. Manifest Destiny refers to the policy aimed at the removal of all Native Americans to establish Caucasian dominion. Story 6. A lot of our education system whitewashes much of history to make our ancestors look better than they were. I graduated high school in 2004 for context. Story 7. Everyone is equal under the law is not true. Wealthy individuals can afford better legal representation. Poor people often rely on overworked public defenders who focus on clearing cases quickly rather than securing the best possible outcome for their clients. Story 8. The Civil War was about states' rights. The declarations of secession make it very clear they were fighting for 1. Slavery and 2. White supremacy. It is surprising how these facts are often omitted from the textbooks. Story 9. It was ingrained in my mind that Franklin Delano Roosevelt only won so many elections because, and I quote, presidents can't change in times of war or national emergency. I thought, okay, neat. Later, after earning my political science degree and continuing my education, I realized that guy was an idiot. Story 10. My summer reading going into college was a book about this very topic called Lies My Teacher Told Me. It was long. Story 11. We are obviously the best country in the whole universe, and every other country should look up to us. Story 12. The United States government is corrupt, yet they teach it is not, and they teach the separation of church and state as if it is a principle when it is not. Story 13. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean. He was later condemned by the Spanish monarchy for his violent actions. Story 14. I remember learning that slavery was abolished. It turns out that chattel slavery was simply replaced with wage slavery. Story 15. In the 1980s, I was told we never lost a war and that we had to exterminate the native people because they were so mean. Story 16. Literally dissecting and relearning most information from school that was designed to keep us ill-informed about our government and their actions. Story 17. The Constitution is not a document that everyone follows to the letter that ensures freedom for all. In reality, our government is held together by gentlemen's agreements and duct tape. Someone decided to break both, and for some reason, no one is stopping him. Story 18. People should check out A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. This offers a counter-narrative, fills in some gaps, and provokes thought. Story 19. They teach you that the United States fights wars to help the good guys win against the bad guys. Plot twist, we are the bad guys. Story 20. Abraham Lincoln did not actually free the slaves. Although he issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the document only declared free those held as slaves in states and territories currently in rebellion against the United States. However, those states had declared themselves a sovereign nation and did not recognize Lincoln's authority, so no slaves were freed there. For slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri never seceded from the Union and were exempt from the proclamation because they were not in rebellion. Consequently, no slaves were freed in the states where Lincoln had legal authority. My enslaved ancestors were not freed until the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments in late 1865, after Lincoln's death. The great emancipator never freed a single enslaved person. Story 21. I don't know that I learned a single true thing about indigenous peoples. Almost all civil unrest was, at best, downplayed, and everything had an egregiously whitewashed perspective. This was not unique to lessons about our own country. Everything was taught from a nationalistic or Eurocentric lens. While some countries have taken the learn from history approach, we have largely taken the who is number one. We are. Who is number two? It does not matter. Approach. Story 22. It was not so much that it was fake. It was more that it was one-sided and manipulated. A lot was conveniently omitted as well. Story 23. The Civil War was fought over both slavery and states' rights. Story 24. America is the land of freedom and the home of the courageous, known as a melting pot. I do not recall America ever truly being any of these things. Story 25. I had a better history syllabus than most in this thread. I don't think I ever got a sugar-coated version of slavery, which is notable since I went to school in a former slave state. I had classes where we read slave narratives, and the things that enslavers considered good by their slaves were still unfathomably cruel and horrible. I think the sheer scale of brutality against indigenous tribes was shortchanged, but I still learned that we routinely broke treaties and fought with tribes during westward expansion. Of any particular Indian war we covered in detail, it was pretty clear we were in the wrong. It would be better if classes covered more indigenous-specific history. I only had one class that began with indigenous history before colonization. Most began with European arrival and the reasons why. One major omission is how much we interfered with other countries in peacetime, like the 19th century banana wars. We learned what the Monroe Doctrine and Roosevelt Corollary were, but only in respect to our relations with European countries, not the Latin American ones. All in all, I feel like the only outright false thing was that all our evils were in the past, and thanks to great men and women, we have now entered the end of history. But that is more of a general sense, not an outright lesson. Story 26. All through high school, whenever we had a test involving the Civil War, there was always a true or false question asking if the Civil War was about slavery. The answer was always false. When I got older, I stumbled upon the Articles of Secession by some of the Confederate states. Many explicitly stated secession was about slavery. I assume the same people who felt the need to lie to us are the same people who later complained that tearing down Confederate monuments was erasing history. These monuments were erected closer to 1965 than 1865. In Winchester, Virginia, there was controversy about renaming the main road through the city Jubal Early Drive. Early was a Confederate general who was an unashamed white supremacist until the day he died. He did not have much of a connection to Winchester. That road was named in the 1990s. Story 27. They did not have wooden teeth, they were real. They enslaved people and made fashion accessories from their skin. Before you respond, read The Delectable Negro. Story 28. State history class was carefully curated. West Virginia history focused on coal propaganda and the Hatfields and McCoys. There was no mention of labor unions except that everyone loved Mother Jones because she was nice. There was no mention of the mine wars. I was in my late 20s before I heard any of that. Story 29. My school emphasized states' rights as the main cause of the Civil War, neglecting to explain the specific rights at issue, namely, the state's right to allow their white residents to enslave their black residents. Story 30. Paul Revere's ride involved several people. Paul Revere was captured by British patrols, and Samuel Prescott was the one who made it to the Old North Church to hang 2 lanterns for by sea. Story 31. Not American, but I can tell you the Alamo was not a heroic last stand. They also do not teach people about how Americans collected Japanese body parts in World War II, do they? That explains a lot. By the way, we Brits gave birth to you Americans. We have a long history. The 100 Years' War for a start, it was actually longer. You are honestly a young country, full of pride. You do remember the Ottoman Empire, right? Be mindful of the pride. That is all I am saying. Story 32. Americans did not intentionally kill Native Americans with smallpox blankets. The first federal health program was to provide vaccines to Native Americans as soon as the disease spread to America. Story 33. Boston Massacre. Yes, it happened, but not like schools teach. It was not the British soldiers lining up people against the wall and shooting. It was more of a flinch and a bang, one shot fired. If you yell, "Hold your fire," loudly enough to trained military personnel, what word will they hear first on a crowded street corner? Story 34. The reasoning behind how the Battle of the Alamo unfolded. My state, Texas, was staunchly pro-slavery, which is why we separated from Mexico, as Mexico was anti-slavery. It had nothing to do with freedom or the misleading information taught in Texas history courses in junior high. As I have aged, I have gone from believing America is number one, as a child, to feeling ashamed to live here and ashamed of our history, which we continually deny, even more so today for various reasons. We have never truly been the good guys, but rather the wealthy people with lots of guns and power. Story 35. The Native Americans were not always peaceful. They sometimes engaged in violent conflicts. They could be ruthless, including acts such as mutilating prisoners of war and other brutal practices. Story 36. Vietnam War was Vietnam choosing its own path. Throwing off colonialism. We were the British. God bless Vietnam. Never give up. Story 37. Literally everything. American education around history and civics is propaganda. It is becoming even more watered down in red states, where it is illegal to mention concepts like slavery, Jim Crow, the genocide of native peoples, and wars of imperialism. American education focuses on teaching students to read, write, and do enough math to fit into the machines of industry. Story 38. Ho 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 ho. It's story time, my dears. Start with the obvious. Christopher Columbus was awful. Everyone already knew the world was round. They just didn't think there was land on this side. He was actually charged with crimes against humanity and stripped of his titles by Queen Isabella after Spain discovered the atrocities he committed against the indigenous people of the Caribbean. Colonial and European Enlightenment principles of freedom and social reorganization did not arise from wealthy aristocrats discussing new ways to be human. We had 250 years of schooling from indigenous Americans who offered scathing critiques of European governments and colonialist behavior generally. Kandiaronk is one notable example. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock were not oppressed religious refugees fleeing intolerance. They opposed the Anglican Church and moved to the Netherlands first, but complained that their children were becoming too Dutch. Their new neighbors disapproved of corporal punishment, and they had difficulty making money. So they moved to the New World, where they could discipline their children as they wished and take over already cultivated land from native groups. The colonies were generally not in favor of rebelling against the British Crown. The rebellion was primarily a problem among wealthy men who did not want to pay taxes. The average peasant farmer's life remained much the same regardless of who ruled. In fact, the Revolutionary War was so unpopular and the army so undermanned that George Washington used kidnapping tactics similar to the British press gangs to fill his ranks. Once drafted, you were threatened with hanging if you deserted your post. This fact received a footnote in high school, but few remember that the first deployment of the United States Army after independence was to brutally suppress a movement of Revolutionary War veterans demanding promise-back pay they had never received. Many state public school curriculums still include the claim or suggestion that the Civil War was about states' rights for self-determination. A state's right to do what exactly? The U.S. population was generally against getting involved in either world war. Today, veterans are remembered in glowing terms, but the America First Party and similar groups strongly opposed fighting Nazis, especially for reasons such as saving persecuted people. Story 39. What was not fabricated? Did the Civil War happen? Yes, but not exactly as it is taught. Did the Bay of Pigs happen? Yes, but not exactly as it is taught. I do not know if every government misleads its citizens, but the United States of America turned it into an art form. Story 40. I would not say fake, as it was generally not really taught and just avoided altogether, but I legitimately had no idea we lost the Vietnam War until I was traveling in Southeast Asia in my early 20s. Story 41. This is probably too niche, but in addition to everything already said, much of the United States Marine Corps indoctrination for newly recruited Marines is exaggerated or plain false. No, the blood stripe does not commemorate the sacrifice of non-commissioned officers at the Battle of Chapultepec in 1847 because it was uniform issue in 1840. Chesty Puller might be the most decorated Marine of all time, but look at what he did to get there. Look at his unit's casualty rates and some of the testimonials of his own men, things never discussed in classroom training. Many outstanding Marines, similarly as controversial as Puller and otherwise, are virtually unknown to today's rank and file and deserve mention, if not study. General Shoup, Colonel William Barber, Major Kukela, Staff Sergeant Albert Ireland, Lieutenant Colonel Earl Ellis, and many others. The devil dog story, apocryphal and grammatically incorrect in German as it is always jarring to me. Not to take anything away from the bayonet and hand-to-hand combat that happened at Belleauwood, but as with most World War I engagements, machine guns and artillery really won the battle. Of course, a commander can order anything simply to be so, much like the commanding officer who ordered my section to pronounce the noun cash as "cashe" instead of the correct cash. Do not get me wrong, I am proud of my service, but as with many things I have found in life, the truth is so much more interesting than the fictional narrative. Story 42. The Puritans and Pilgrims were escaping religious persecution, as if they were innocent victims of those harsh European authorities. Story 43. Most of it. If you want to learn anything about America's history before you enter adulthood, you have to take an American history class in high school and hope you have a decent teacher. Everything you learn about America until you are 12 is basically inaccurate. Story 44. America is not the only country that has done wrong, such as committing genocide against native peoples, waging wars of conquest, and oppressing women. In fact, every country over 50 years old, as well as most newer ones, has engaged in similar actions. Additionally, the atomic bomb was not dropped just for experimentation or curiosity. It was used to save millions of lives by avoiding a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands. Story 45. In general, if anything bad happened and it was the fault of the United States, it did not happen, it was not discussed, it was somebody else's fault, or it really was not bad. The vast majority of our history is distorted because a portion of the population insists that it be a mythical story of the formation of paradise under just circumstances. If we actually learned our real history, we would know where the country did well, where it did poorly, and why people perceive us the way they do. We could improve instead of pretending to be the victim whenever something happens. Story 46. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That last bit was just a lie. Absolute lie. Story 47. Thanksgiving and the smallpox blankets. Growing up, my mom kept a framed sign above the window in the dining room that stated, "No Irish need apply." Once I asked and received the honest answer, I could never look at the country the same. Story 48. We are the best country in the world. I am not an American. There are other countries I would rather live in than the United States. It is still a great place, and the majority of people are wonderful. Story 49. What I learned, I did not learn in school. I learned from school that expectations of life apply only to some. I learned from life otherwise. People who hunger for their own success or their chosen path get more of themselves. People who move to love and support do it better and are free. Story 50. Throughout elementary and middle school, I was taught that segregation ended with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. However, I attended a high school that was an all-black segregated school until the 1980s. Story 51. I grew up as a real patriotic Boy Scout and was very depressed when I learned the truth as a teenager. I decided it was better to learn the cynical version from the start. My son is very advanced in verbal skills, so when he was 6, we read the first 2 chapters of the Howard Zinn book about Columbus and the start of slavery with only light censorship. When he was 8, we spent about 3 hours on my oral history of the United States without sugarcoating. I avoided graphic violence but explained that violence occurred, which groups were involved at what times, and why. My hope is that he will understand the complexity of the country, recognizing both good and bad aspects, and that it is important to build on the good. I want him to avoid the shock of realizing we are not always the good country. His generation seems much more political than mine, so he probably would have figured this out earlier anyway. Story 52. This documentary by Peter Jackson makes a convincing argument that Americans were not the first to fly. It includes footage of Richard Pierce's flight on March 31, 1903, in New Zealand. Spoiler, yes, it is a hoax. Watch it anyway, then show it to your friends without telling them it is a hoax. Content warning: Harvey Weinstein is interviewed a couple of times. My answer to the original poster's question is that I was taught that the first flight was by William and Orville Wright on December 17, 1903. Period. There was no controversy about this at all. There is, in fact, controversy about this. Story 53. The size of America's involvement in World War II was overstated by omission. The scale of troops was often compared to the British and Canadians. While the United States had higher numbers of troops on the ground in those comparisons, the scale of fighting on the Eastern Front of the European theater was vast and dwarfed the Western Allies collectively. For example, D-Day was one of the major battles highlighted for its high death toll to take those beaches, specifically Omaha Beach. However, it is unclear whether Utah Beach was equally emphasized. The Warsaw Uprising, an underground resistance movement, lasted for 63 days with an average daily death toll similar to that on D-Day. Armed Polish civilians in Warsaw made the American military effort look small in comparison. Considering how massive the Eastern Front was, there is no real comparison. It is often said that Churchill contributed to the war effort through diplomacy by bringing the Allies together. Roosevelt contributed industrially by building war machines, ships, guns, and supplies, and Stalin contributed blood through the massive loss of lives fighting the Germans. Another misconception about World War II involves the Battle of Britain. It is reportedly not taught in Western countries. Before the battle, Germany focused on bombing airfields, hangars, planes, and factories responsible for aircraft production, adhering to the Geneva Convention by avoiding civilian targets. Although the Germans were brutal in other theaters, they initially played by the rules against the British. They expected a peaceful surrender and saw the rules as convenient, confident in their victory. However, production and plane counts showed that within months the British Royal Air Force would no longer exist, leaving the skies to Germany unopposed. The British used area bombing at night to counter German air superiority. They followed strict rules and had no civilian targets, as they needed to visually confirm their targets. With limited fuel, bombers had orders to drop bombs into the English Channel if targets could not be spotted. One British air commander, unable to spot his target, chose to ignore these orders, deciding bombs should not be wasted. From the lead plane, he ordered bombs dropped on civilian targets. Germany broadcast outrage and vowed retaliatory civilian bombings, communicated in English so the British public would be aware. From then on, the Luftwaffe targeted only civilians. The air commander was quietly court-martialed but never stood trial for war crimes. However, this shift in Luftwaffe strategy allowed the British to rebuild their plane numbers and maintain airfields, ultimately leading to their victory in the Battle of Britain. This is not meant to evoke sympathy for Germany during World War II, as their atrocities were far worse. However, Western war crimes, including the fire bombings carried out primarily by the Americans, have been conveniently omitted from much of the historical narrative, and no one stood trial for these actions. Story 54. The United States abandoned Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There was a mass exodus of military personnel and their families. The military did not want to lose personnel and abandoned the indigenous population to the cruelty of the Japanese. The United States only intervened because the islands were strategically important during the war. The islands were not considered important enough to defend until they were needed as bases to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 8,000 to 10,000 of the indigenous people died during the Japanese occupation before the United States intervened. They never fought to protect the freedom of the indigenous people who inhabited those islands. Story 55. I hated history until college when I learned what was real. Who knew the truth could be so interesting and lie so boring? Story 56. Nothing I learned was false, but it was more about the level of detail that you get from middle school to high school to college. I also grew up until age 14 in Italy, so it was nice to see that facts match up when learning the same stories from different continents, although the perspectives obviously change. One thing I will say was different was the matter-of-fact way we studied colonization and slavery of the Americas, and I do not remember the sugarcoating of it that we get in the United States. In Italy, it is not a sensitive subject at all. It is just another thing that happened, and yes, we are proud of Columbus. Story 57. I grew up in the Deep South, And I had a middle school teacher say that the American Civil War was not fought over slavery but over states' rights. The southern states cared about a specific right, the right to own slaves, or if that was prohibited, the right to form their own country and then own slaves. Some people also insisted that the Confederate flag was only about heritage. Story 58. I had a bit of an odd upbringing, but my father was very interested in the American Civil War, so that was passed down to me. When we studied John Brown in high school, a lesson that should have taken a day or two, I got into a running argument with the teacher, who claimed that Brown was a crazy old man who wanted violence. I remember the teacher expressing frustration when I asked what else would solve the problem of slavery except the death of slave owners. Story 59. The whole colonial era was portrayed as positive in my school education. It was described as a time when people discovered others in need around the world and helped them. Story 60. I had a history class in college, and the textbook was A People's History by Howard Zinn. I knew bias existed, but that really showed me how the same topics written from different perspectives vary widely. Not that Zinn's was any less biased, just from the other side. Story 61. When we entered the world as working adults, we were expected to write everything in cursive. Story 62. I was never given the loyalist position regarding the American Revolution, nor the fact that a third of the colonies were patriot, a third loyalist, and a third indifferent. The more I study it, the harder it is to justify the Revolutionary War. Story 63. They said communism is where everyone gets the same thing, with the example that everyone would get size 8 shoes even if they did not fit everyone. This is because the government only has one shoe factory that just makes size 8 shoes. Genius. Story 64. Reading this, it strikes me again how lucky I was to have my 5th grade teacher. She told us about the horrors of American history, such as Christopher Columbus cutting off people's hands, and the truth about how many Native Americans were murdered. She taught us everything we needed to understand about America. She was an amazing teacher in many other ways, but once again, I am grateful to you, Ms. A, for being the best teacher. Story 65. The biggest issue my father and all his friends discuss is regarding Bangladesh. He is Pakistani, and despite his friends being educated at all levels, from lower class to upper class schools, they were all misinformed about Bangladesh. My father's heart breaks every time it is brought up. He wishes that everyone had not let the situation deteriorate, despite Bangladesh's significant support in the creation of Pakistan. He discovered that some of his friends' parents, who lived in that region when Bangladesh was still part of Pakistan, had to flee for their lives or were imprisoned for extended periods. To this day, I believe the education is not clear about this major mistake by the Pakistan government. Henry Kissinger was also mentioned as involved, but I am unsure of the validity of that claim. People simply say Bangladesh was part of Pakistan and then became independent. It is tragic. Story 66. I also remember my middle school teacher telling us that September 11th was unconfirmed if it had any terrorists involved. It was like 2008. She kept insisting on it. Possibly she just did not want kids in Canada to get scared. But I do not know. Story 67. The implied narrative that we are the good guys in almost every single thing America is involved in turns out to be nearly never true. Sometimes we are the lesser bad guys, but rarely actually good, moral, and principled actors. Story 68. In school in Ireland, we were taught that the colors of the flag are green, white, and gold. The colors are actually green, white, and orange. I think this was born out of a strange Irish habit of avoiding talking about difficult things because the orange represents the Protestant tradition in the north of the country. Story 69. Not so much wrong or fake, just an omission of other countries' contributions to World War II. I watched a show about Polish submariners. I did not know Poland had submarines. Now I wonder if there are any other omissions. Story 70. I grew up in New Jersey, and upon some research, New Jersey schools are surprisingly ranked highly among state public schooling rankings. That worries me because while I disagree with many people in this discussion about common statements such as nobody told us there was more to the Pilgrim and Native American story, and Christopher Columbus was a lie, which are all obviously false, I definitely learned about both sides of our history in class. As poor as my public school education was, if it is among some of the best in the country, I am very concerned about what the average person across the United States has even learned in school, if anything at all. Story 71. In grade school, I was taught to be afraid of Germans and Arabs, mainly by one teacher with strong political views. In high school, I learned that one of my friends was Arab after his house was vandalized for being Muslim. He had been hiding the fact that he was Arab and Muslim because our town was predominantly Jewish. The same year, I went camping with a kid from Austria and was afraid of him until the end of the camping trip, when I realized that not all Germans are Nazis. Story 72. My history teacher was also the baseball coach, so every day in class he would swing a yardstick like it was a bat and talk about whatever sports game was on the night before. Story 73. The way the government runs. They told us about the system of checks and balances and how elected officials work to help the people who elected them. They also told us that bribery is illegal and election contributions are limited so candidates cannot buy elections. Elected officials are not allowed to use their office for personal gain. Story 74. How we are always portrayed as heroes in times of war, but it turns out cases like World War II were American politics made camps for anyone Japanese in the West. Story 75. The Civil War started because of a principled disagreement on the scope of states' rights. It was really one right in particular. Story 76. Have you ever seen a Tom Cruise movie? He is always fighting for and against authority, always doing the right thing. That is how our history is taught. We essentially teach that in every war we were the victims. Everything good on the planet comes from the United States of America, and we can do no wrong. The real history is more like that of a mob boss. Story 77. We were taught that we were the good guys in every war. The Revolutionary War? Of course. World War II? Okay, sure. But the Mexican-American War? Vietnam? It turns out we may not have had humanity's best interests at heart. And that devastating genocide we committed in the Philippines at the turn of the last century. I never even heard of it until I was an adult. Story 78. I cannot think of anything I learned that was outright fake. I can think of many things that were so oversimplified that they led to false conclusions. Story 79. The goal of the Vietnam War was to bankrupt the Soviet Union, and it worked. Based on the true goals of the United States, we won in Vietnam. Fortunately, I already knew how wrong this was. Story 80. There are 3 countries in North America: Canada, the United States of America, and Mexico. Then there is Central America, South America, and Latin America. Story 81. I learned that apparently the United States cavalry spread smallpox blankets to Native Americans. However, I found out that this is false and there is no evidence that it ever happened. Story 82. Why do so many people keep referring to Columbus and the colonies? Columbus was never anywhere near what ended up becoming the United States. Story 83. Growing up in the South, the Civil War was downplayed as just a dispute over states' rights and partially related to slavery. Story 84. I thought that America was a power for positive good and helping developing countries in the world, and that we could trust our media. I found out it is a power for negative, evil, and suppressing the rise of developing countries, and that we cannot trust our media. Story 85. Putting aside the simplified to the point of caricature version told in elementary school and junior high, and just sticking to the advanced placement United States history I got in high school, it is not so much that what we got was fake as much as it was grossly misrepresentative of what happened. It was pure propaganda. But the lie is more in what was left out than what was untrue. For example, the Native Americans. They were present at Jamestown and the first Thanksgiving. Then they disappear from the narrative only to reappear for the French and Indian War, which was mostly contextualized in terms of how it led to the Revolution and not why the Native Americans were fighting with the French against the British and Americans. Maybe Sacagawea gets a mention along with Lewis and Clark after Thomas Jefferson buys Louisiana from Napoleon. The next mention comes when Andrew Jackson is president and commits the Trail of Tears, which is never once labeled what it actually is: systematic genocide. A few decades later, there is a mention of the Western Indian Wars in the post-Civil War period. And that is it. But somehow they now have casinos. Suffice to say, United States history would be very different if told from their perspective. There is a similar issue around how slavery is taught. It receives more attention than the Native Americans, but it is still grossly downplayed in terms of how brutal it actually was and how much impact it had in early history. At least these days, I believe the fact that Jefferson raped his slaves gets a side note amid the praise of him writing the Declaration of Independence. One might make a similar observation about women, who apparently did not exist until the first suffragettes in the 19th century and seemed to exist only erratically after that. Or just regular people at all. The United States in United States history is mostly the federal government, not the places that became parts of the country but have their own history, such as Florida, Texas, California, Alaska, and Hawaii. It is a succession of presidents as if they were the most important and only things worth discussing. Also, the wars that were fought to acquire those other places, almost all acquired by war, are never described as imperialism but as manifest destiny. Then history just kind of stopped around the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War. That is how far we got by the time we graduated. For some reason, it was very important that we learn about the presidential campaign of 1840, but topics like second-wave feminism, the civil rights era, the Vietnam War, and the wrongdoing of Nixon and Reagan were neglected. What relevance could any of that have to our lives? Story 86. When I graduated high school in 2015, the historiography was basically that we had civil rights, which made racism a thing of the past. The next 10 years proved me painfully wrong. Story 87. The G-rated versions of the founding fathers' lives omit slavery, rape, mistreatment of wives and children, adultery and mistresses, genocide and agnosticism, atheism, deism, and religious bigotry. The political intrigue, social climbing, and class warfare are also left out. The real reasons often involve not persecution but escaping misdeeds, lawbreaking, or criminal prosecution due to rigid or hateful beliefs, or even acts of terror or treason, which made it impossible for them to remain in their original locations. You do not learn much of this until high school, if at all. Story 88. The land appropriation and genocide of Native Americans, from Columbus to the Trail of Tears. Story 89. In the South, we are taught that the Civil War was not fought over slavery but rather the states' rights to decide for themselves on matters of policy. The policy in question was whether or not slavery was legal. Story 90. They show us the civil rights movement almost exclusively through black and white pictures, even though color photographs were common by then. This is probably because we see black and white photos and think, wow, that happened so long ago. No, it did not. The government just wants you to think it did to continue avoiding accountability. Story 91. I was taught that Capitol riots would be met with military force. Story 92. Learned the Alamo was something worth remembering fondly as a last stand by Americans against a foreign invader. The context that the Texans were the invaders, took land from Mexico, and were trying to hold onto their slaves was never discussed. Story 93. Most of the moral stories about our involvement in World War II are tenuous. Think tanks were writing for years before the war that a conflict with Japan was necessary to control trade in the East. It is also said that we saved the concentration camp prisoners. That was a hostage situation. Germany publicly threatened that if the United States entered the war, they would kill the prisoners because they knew they would lose if America joined the conflict. So we had to go and save them, of course. I admit that I have no idea if it would have been any different if we had not intervened. Story 94. We were taught that all the ants in the world outweigh all the humans. I became suspicious because ants are tiny, and the teacher who taught this was overweight. After some research, I discovered that the information was not correct. Story 95. Nothing. We went over the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the First World War, and the Second World War in detail, including every major battle. Story 96. I feel like we got a lot of America was so important, only to realize it was not as much as we were told. We thought we were Britain's only focus during the Revolution or that we single-handedly turned the tide in both World War I and World War II. Even now, if you bring it up, people act like I just betrayed America. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.